This city is very large, handsome, and well-peopled, so much so that in all the East I have met with none which excel it. The grandeur, the opulence, and the beauty in which the king delights, the whole is superior to that of Constantinople or Rome.
Those were the descriptions of this city, Isfahan, written by travellers 350 years ago. It was called then half the world, an evocative tribute rather like the eternal city for Rome. But when the travellers came here, they found a city that was bigger than Rome, bigger than Paris or London. And it's easy to see now what the lure then must have been. It was a new capital city built on the grand design. But to European eyes, it must have seemed rather alien, rather exotic.
Isfahan became the capital city under Shah Abbas, and under Abbas, Persia rejoined the world as a power in her own right. The recovery from the devastation of the Mongols and of Tamburlaine was long, erratic, and often painful. It began with a group of Muslim mystics called the صفویه. Within 2 centuries, their spirit was transformed into a violent force. It came like a wind, rising from the subtropical province of Gilan by the Caspian Sea. In 1499, over these hills, through the rainforests and across the mountains into the plateau of Iran, rode a charismatic religious leader. He will come out of Gilan like a burning sun, and with a sword sweep infidelity from the earth. He was a boy of 13, called Ismail. When this prodigy appeared among the Turkoman tribes, they were drawn to him as a new rallying force. At the heart of Ismail's crusade was an old division within the world of Islam. One wing of this division was called Shiism, and it was under this banner that Ismail gathered the tribes. "I am God's mystery," he told them. "Wherever you sow me, I will grow. Whenever you call me, I will come up." From these tribes, Ismail gathered a zealous army. His crusaders were as savage as the Mongols. They hacked through all opposition. There was massacre and torture. They were called the Redheads, or Kizilbash, after the color of their turbans. No one, they said, can become a Kizilbash until his heart is a-burning and his breast a-bleeding like a ruby. The crusade broke into bloodshed here, in the Blue Mosque of Tabriz.
God and the Immaculate Imams are with me, and I fear no one. By God's help, if the people utter one word of protest, I will draw the sword and leave not one of them alive.
In 1501, Ismail was crowned the first Shah of the Safavid dynasty. The Kizilbash terror engulfed the Iranian plateau, but had one positive result. The diverse peoples were fused together, and together they faced threats from outside. In 1514, the artillery of the Ottoman Turks overcame Ismail's cavalry at the Battle of Chaldiran. The horse had lost its primacy. The mature Ismail was said to be as amiable as a girl, as lively as a fawn, and stronger than any of his lords. In the court at Tabriz, Ismail took on the familiar trappings of Persian kingship and became a statesman, reorganizing the machinery of government. But his crucial step was to formalize Shiism into the state religion, giving Persia for the first time a separate religious identity within the world of Islam. But Shiism needed more scholarly and theological weight in Persia. To provide it, Ismail brought in religious leaders from Bahrain and Syria.
مرحوم آقای آخوند منع ملازمه میکنن بین صحت و بین امر، بلکه میگن صحت عمل برای اینه که الان اندل جهل بجر این اخفا.
But as the holy men conferred and debated, an old conflict arose in a new, acute form. A conflict about where the power in Persia really lay, with the spiritual or the political leadership. For centuries, these two powers would compete for the allegiance of the people. The fervor of Shiism sprang from a sense of martyrdom. These people believe that the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad were massacred, that the leadership of Islam fell into the hands of usurpers. They are carrying the symbolic coffins of two of those descendants, Ali and Hussein. The spirit of martyrdom is still infectious, separating the Shia from the majority of the Muslim world, who are Sunni. These deeply felt passions helped the people to unite after much suffering. The strongest focus of this unity was the worship of the holy martyrs.
Awe-inspiring and sustained outbursts of religious fervor. And the culmination of all this energy, not just religious, but political and social as well, was expressed here in this new capital city, Isfahan, which was presided over, literally presided over from this veranda, this grandstand, by the remarkable Shah Abbas. John Gurney, what was it that made Shah Abbas, do you think, choose this place, Isfahan, for his grand design?
There had been other Safavid capitals in Tabriz and Qazvin, but Qazvin, the latter, was too close to the Ottoman borders, and he was shifting his military offensive at that time away from the Uzbeks in the northeast towards the Ottomans in the northwest. In addition to that, Isfahan too had long been a great center of Islamic culture. It had long connections with the Safavid dynasty and was situated closer to the center of the Iranian plateau. Moreover, Isfahan had remained relatively free from the domination of those Turkish amirs and Qizilbash leaders who had created so much confusion and tribal anarchy in the first century of Safavid rule since the foundation of the dynasty.
And what would you say, to you anyway, are the most essential ingredients of Shah Abbas's plan?
The centerpiece, of course, is this Maidan itself. The major buildings remain essentially the same as they did in his period. The really great difference between his time and now is that the center of the Maidan was clear, was empty. There was no pool or lawns. It was here that Shah Abbas received ambassadors, where he paraded their presence before him in the square, where he himself took part in polo games. Perhaps most important of all was the use that the square was made of as a bazaar. It was here that Sir Thomas Herbert described the bazaar as the most spacious, the most pleasant, and most aromatic in the universe.
The grand plan drew together the strands of the capital's life. To the west of the square, the palace complex. To the south, the royal mosque, flanked by part of the bazaar. But the most extensive part of the bazaar began at the northern end of the Maidan and ran over a mile to the oldest part of Isfahan through a maze of covered arcades and open courtyards. The main stem of the bazaar made a direct umbilical link with the heart of the old city, the Friday Mosque. An extensive new city was laid out to the south of the old. A great boulevard was built, running 2.5 miles to the river, and remains the hub of Isfahan today. The river was called the Zayande Rud, or Giver of Life. It rises from the highlands and never reaches the sea. Spanning it were bridges, not simply for crossing, but for pleasure. Today, another Isfahan engulfs the plan, but the pinnacle remains, the royal mosque of Shah Abbas.
When I first entered the royal mosque, I was struck by two feelings. A sense of awe, of course, at its size and its grandeur, and at the same time a sense almost of desolation, really, of disorientation, because to the Western eye there are no fixed points here. There seems to be no central nave or altar. It's difficult to find your bearings. There are no comforting images of the Mother of Christ, for example. No covering, obviously. No protection for the individual from the sun or from his appointment with, his communication with, his reckoning with his God, who he's told is everywhere and yet is tangibly nowhere. Those were some of my first impressions, Professor Grabar, but of course spending more time here, looking at it more, it's much more complex than that, really, isn't it? Do you find the mosque desolate, for instance?
Yes, it is desolate, but it is desolate because a mosque is not like a church or a shrine, a place where the holy presence or holy activities take place all the time. The mosque is a setting. It is a setting for all kinds of different activities. As you enter it, you don't know which way to go. But the moment you start using the mosque for prayer, the mosque itself tells you where to go. The people will move towards Mecca, pray towards the mihrab in the back of the mosque, and there is a horizontal direction given to the mosque. There is also a vertical direction. As people pray, they sort of bend over, and then looking up, moving up towards the dome, the whole vertical range of the composition of the monument appears in front of them.
Do you feel at all defenseless in a mosque?
As you noted, the sun bears down on the mosque just as on the square outside. But there are, in this area without protection, there are certain things that are familiar and repetitive, which tend to bring it back to you, make it more real, more human. For instance, you have the familiar Quranic quotations, which a believer would immediately recognize. He just reads one word and remembers the rest. Or the names of God, which to us are meaningless because we don't know the vocabulary or the language. But to a Muslim are immediately familiar expressions that make sense. And then in the design of the decoration, there is a constant repetition of the same motifs, the same patterns, with only very minor variations.
The Royal Mosque is awesome, of course, and so is a cathedral. How do you feel different entering the mosque and entering a cathedral?
There is a different emphasis. This particular mosque is awesome, and probably more awesome than most other mosques, because it is a royal creation. It is an imperial mosque. And this, it was a mosque that was almost organized so that the emperor who created it would be the intermediary between man and God. And this appears in the composition of the mosque, in its organization, beginning with the facade. This facade in a cathedral would have Christ in majesty, or the Last Judgment, or some obvious religious statement. But what do we have here? We have an inscription going all around the portal, which talks about the great king, the powerful prince. He does call him dust of the threshold of the prophet, but this is sort of royal false humility. In fact, it is a sort of great statement of the power of the king, of the emperor, who has created this mosque in his broad composition of the city. It is through his archway that one enters first. And then what happens? You go through darkness, then light, then darkness again, and then you are in the courtyard. And in the courtyard, his name is no longer there. There are the Quranic statements about God, and at the very top of the minaret, we have simply written God, Allah. So that inside God is present, but the person or the institution that makes it possible for you to get to God is the emperor.
Really does seem, standing in the middle of this majestic and reverberating dome, that this whole building was the ultimate act in piety. But there was more to it than that. The two great powers of the state, the ecclesiastical and the temporal, always had to be reconciled. So by making this mosque the pinnacle of his new capital city, Shah Abbas was making a shrewd political gesture as well. However earthly his empire and his ambitions, it would be difficult after this for anybody to accuse him of neglecting his spiritual duty. And this building, erected to the glory of God, served also as a very potent reminder to friends and enemies alike of the glory of Shah Abbas and his rule.
Abbas brought a prosperity which enabled Safavid society to parade in high fashions. They went to see and to be seen along the great boulevard, the Chahar, meaning 4 gardens, lined with palaces. One Western visitor said it was more like a forest than a city. Outside this world, new tides were running, some seen, some not. The Pilgrim Fathers sailed, and America was colonized. Westerners came east to offer their skills and donned Eastern robes, like this English adventurer, Sir Robert Shirley. Shirley advised Abbas on his army, but much more effective was Abbas's decision to staff his army with Circassians, Georgians, and Armenians, a step in breaking the hold of traditional tribal leaders. As a tactic to buy time, Abbas first ceded territory in the west to the Ottoman Turks, and then in the east he pushed back the Uzbeks. Now, sure of his strength, he turned against the Ottomans and regained the old imperial boundaries of Persia. Within these boundaries, Persia had acquired a new racial and tribal personality, a new confidence.
Well, John, we've looked at some of the magnificent exteriors created by Shah Abbas, the visionary, but when one looks at the inner man, there was a sort of narrower, darker, more mysterious side to his nature too, wasn't there?
Yes, indeed. Perhaps the greatest blot on his reputation has been the way he treated his closest relatives. I'm thinking particularly of his brothers and his father, who were imprisoned shortly after his accession, of the blinding of 2 of his sons, and perhaps most tragic of all, the murder of his eldest son and apparently the next successor, Safi Mirza.
It's an extraordinary thing to think of a father doing that to his sons. I mean, how did he carry it out? I mean, did he do it himself, face to face?
He didn't communicate it directly. In the instance of Safi Mirza's death, he gave order to a prominent court official to carry it out, and that court official in fact refused, said that he wouldn't do it, and another person was deputed to do it in his place. The instance of Safi Mirza is particularly tragic because he himself, I think, was innocent of any implication in a plot against his father.
And did Shah Abbas ever learn that his son was innocent?
Yes, he did, and that, of course, was the cause of great remorse on his part. After the assassination, he locked himself away in his room for many days, refused to see the person who had carried out the execution, and later, some time afterwards, he in fact summoned him and ordered that man, lesser court official, to kill his own son. And later, after that had been done, he saw that official again and said to him, "Now you may realize what the sorrow was when you brought me news of your killing of my only son."
But did the man reply, "You told me to"?
Yes, he did, and Abbas said, "Now you are the equal of your Shah in this respect."
What was it that motivated him to all that we've just heard?
I think to understand that, one must look back at the experiences and events of his childhood. First of all, he had seen or heard about the murder of his uncle, the murder also by a group of Qizilbash Amirs, those Turkish tribal leaders, of his eldest brother, the way in which his father's reign had been thrown into total confusion by their activities, and the way also in which he himself had been exploited and used to lead a rebellion against his father, which of course eventually resulted in his own accession to the throne.
And what about the effects in general on him? Did it show in other ways these insecurities, these paranoias?
It's said that he changed his bed several times each night, just as this building here has got several small chambers within it. So likewise, it's most probable, did the private quarters of his palace. It's there that one can imagine him moving from places previously prepared, so that few knew where he was sleeping that night. The fear of assassination was never far from his mind.
And do you think it was this fear of assassination, or was it remorse that led to the fits of melancholy for which he's renowned?
I think it's undoubtedly the latter. The murder of Safi Mirza and the anxieties he had about the succession weighed very heavily upon him and caused him in times of banquets or feasts somehow to seem abstracted, aloof, distant, whilst the festivities were proceeding around him.
On the surface, the palaces and pavilions of Shah Abbas's Isfahan seemed devoted to pleasure, but under the opulence was a calculated policy. Abbas, a watchful host, was practicing skillful diplomacy. Where diplomacy could buy time more cheaply than war, he always used it. Ambassadors found him a shrewd negotiator. The Roman traveler Della Valle noted,
"He plays with the whole world and never concludes anything against his own interests."
Sir Thomas Herbert described the princes and courtiers
like so many inanimate statues, placed cross-legged, joining their bums to the ground, their backs to the wall, and their eyes to a constant object, the king.
And Sir Anthony Shirley noted,
"In this court there was not a gentleman but the king. The rest were shadows, which moved with his body."
Towards the end of a long and drunken reception, De la Valle saw Abbas slip away to lean against one of the pillars while the musicians played on.
The king listened intently, but in the posture of great melancholy.
Sometimes the king walked alone.
He will come to the greengrocers, fruiterers, and those who sell preserves and sweetmeats. Here he will take a mouthful of this, then another of that. In one place, sample a preserve, in another, taste some fruit. Or he will enter the shop of a shoemaker, pick up a pair of shoes that takes his fancy, put them on at the door, and then continue on his way.
Now, John, this bazaar that we're catching right now just before rush hour, I mean, is in structure really very much as it was in the 17th century, isn't it?
Yes, certainly. This part of the bazaar was built by Shah Abbas I, extended throughout the course of the 17th century, and has remained essentially the same in structure. It comprises, besides the shops that you can see around us now, schools and baths. Mosques themselves are interknit into the fabric of the bazaar.
So the bazaar is what, a microcosm of the society, or the whole society for the
Not really,
middle and lower castes, or what?
Well, on the contrary, say it represents the whole society, because there are no residential quarters themselves in the bazaar. They are outside in the areas, districts adjoining to the bazaar itself. So they're places where you can wash, where you can work, where you can pray, where you can learn. And of course, where the basic commerce of the town itself went on. This was the hub of the commercial life, retailing, wholesaling of the metropolis, the Safavid Empire in the 17th century.
And now we're off the main thoroughfare and into what would you call this, warehouse, John?
Yes, this is the team chair, one of many that ran throughout the length and breadth of the bazaar in those days. And it was here where the wholesale merchants would bring some of their commodities from which the retailers would buy and then sell in the bazaar itself.
Who were the main traders, in fact? The Armenians were very important?
Yes, that was another of Shah Abbas's innovations. He brought them down to Isfahan and settled at first the small Armenian community south of the river in New Julfa.
Their homeland was leveled to make a buffer zone between Persia and the Ottomans, and the Armenians were forced on an arduous march south to Isfahan.
Very quickly they prospered and thrived and took a very leading part in the silk commodity. And silk, of course, was the most important product at that time. It was for silk that the foreign companies came to Isfahan particularly.
And what were the great trade routes of the time, really?
Well, they went in most directions, to the northeast, to Central Asia, eastwards to Kandahar, and then onwards to India, south towards the Gulf itself, then to India that way, or to Europe, which was the new trade route by the sea opening up, northwest to Istanbul, or southwest to Baghdad.
Was it an enviable trade to be a clockmaker in the 17th century?
Yes, very much so. The Safavid rulers had something of a fetish about clocks, and one of the most prized presents that could be sent, gifts that could be sent from Europe, and sent through their ambassadors, was really gifts of Venetian clocks or other European makes. And European watch or clock makers were received very well in the Safavid court.
Were the 17th century Iranians technologically minded? I mean, were they interested in that whole field?
Well, there's some aspects of traditional sciences and Islamic learning which were highly sophisticated. I'm thinking particularly, say, of some aspects of medicine, of the making of astrolabes, which do represent Islamic science perhaps at its most precise and its finest. But there were some aspects at the same time of European technology of the 17th century which weren't assimilated or absorbed.
But neither could Europeans easily understand Persian ways. The habit of regular bathing, for example, was strange to Sir Thomas Herbert.
The insides of these hothouses are divided into many cells, some being for delight, others for sweating in. The truth is, bathing with these is as it was with the Greeks and Romans, no less familiar than eating and drinking. Yet the excess doubtless weakens the body by making it soft and delicate.
And of course, when you read 17th century chronicles, European accounts of the 17th century, there is extremely little indication of the lives, the long hours of work, the kinds of food, the degrees of poverty of these levels of society.
The veneer of Isfahan was not an accurate reflection of life in Persia, although Western travelers were misled by it. The capital was a prosperous oasis. Beyond it lay great extremes of wealth and poverty. Perhaps a third of the nation was still nomadic. In villages remote in the mountains or on the brink of deserts, life was hard and marginal. In contrast, royal and wealthy patrons in the cities employed craftsmen whose work gave everything from the mundane to the sumptuous a distinctive Safavid style.
It's fascinating to watch all these techniques because even though a few of them are new, fairly modern techniques, most of them are still the old techniques used for hundreds of years. And the objects that were made were primarily useful objects. All kinds of very practical objects used for very practical purposes in daily life. This is an old Muslim tradition to have transformed the objects of daily life used commonly by everyone, to have transformed them into beautiful objects by inventing and developing all kinds of techniques. For instance, the technique of luster painting, a special technique used for ceramics that tends to give to the object of ceramic a very shiny character, almost like metal, almost like gold.
به خودش پیشرفت پیش آمد به خودش تا 5 تا بخوره زدی با آبی رو خودش با آبش همه به خودش.
The peak is the carpet. In part it is our own taste that has seen in the carpet from Persia something that excited our own taste and our own needs. But there is more to the carpet than that. Carpets have been known for thousands of years. Very few of them have been preserved. And it is only from the Safavid period that we're beginning to have large numbers of great carpets. But what is interesting is that the best ones among them utilized a vocabulary of forms which is found almost every place in the art of the period. For instance, this particular carpet has medallions of flowers or pseudo-flowers that seems to explode in the center of the carpet or in some of its corners. In exactly the same way, the tile decoration of the large mosques also has these medallions that explode in this fashion. Or we have a tendril of with little flowers that spreads all around the carpet, and this again is seen in architectural decoration, on lacquer objects, in the decoration and illumination of books, one finds these very same motifs appearing all the time. For the carpet is a strange thing, really. It is a very practical thing. You walk on a carpet, you sit on a carpet, you hang a carpet on your walls, but at the same time, it is a kind of object which is very, which can be appreciated in several different ways. There is a sensuousness of the whole carpet, so a pleasure to touch it. One wants to take one's shoes off, one's socks off, sort of roll in the carpet for pure physical pleasure. Art which, in the Safavid period, probably had the most consistent aesthetic purpose was painting. There is a celebrated illustrated manuscript of Nizami's poems at the British Museum, which is one of the truly great masterpieces of design, of color, of illustrating in brilliant compositions the court or nature. All the themes of Persian painting are there. The uncertainty about its reality. Are we dealing with something that really happened, or are we dealing with somebody's invention of a paradisiac world in which little silhouettes play a certain game? But the technique of drawing, of coloring, has reached really its perfection at that time. And what is fascinating about this painting already in the 16th century is that underneath the brilliance of the exterior, of the colors, there is another note that is being sounded. For instance, here is another example of a miniature illustrating poems, and at first glance the same colors, the same brilliance of composition, until one starts looking in detail. For what we see here is a scene of drunks. Everybody in this picture is besotted. And not only are they all drunk, but the personages themselves are respectable older men of society, of the proper bourgeois society of the times. Even the angels on top of the building and are sort of dancing around in a drunken orgy. And all this is accompanied by 3 musicians who are dressed in improbable animal skins, giving to the whole scene a feeling of a sort of rather decadent orgy. There is an implication here of a kind of social criticism that the artist, already in the 16th century, saw in the paintings he depicted, in the traditional subjects he depicted, a way to criticize or to portray the society that surrounded him with some venom or some tendencies to show the bad sides, which is the less pleasant side of the society. It appears even in the representations of the court. These wonderful portraits of the ladies and gentlemen of the court of Shah Abbas and his successors, and they are beautifully painted, beautifully drawn, and yet they always appear too young, without vigor, without strength. They appear almost as though they could rule anything. Most of the time they are shown with a cup, with a jug of wine, as though they were ready to be drunk, or already are drunk sometimes in a few instances. Clearly, those are not people who could rule a huge empire, who could run a whole system. And there is a sense in those paintings of a ruling class that is somewhat or somehow falling apart.
This kind of decadence alienated the religious leaders.
Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Subhanallah, Subhanallah, Subhanallah. Sami Allahu liman hamidah. Allahu Akbar.
the fervor of the religious leaders broke the brittle unity which Abbas had created. The loyalties of the Orthodox were now more firmly than ever directed to the religious authorities.
Given the sort of dynamic which the empire showed under Shah Abbas, it might have seemed as though it was set on a path of unending prosperity and expansion. But it all turned out to be not a golden spring at all, but an Indian summer. And by the end of the Safavid dynasty, the country had slipped into a long period of stagnation, of decline, and of decadence. Indeed, there's more than a whiff of that decadence right here in the Hasht Behesht, the royal pleasure house where some of the more indulgent years were played out.
After the confident, outward-looking age of Abbas, Persia turned in on herself, increasingly bypassed by world trade, as the routes moved from land to sea, and mismanagement made things worse. Court life was lascivious, isolated, self-indulgent. Abbas had incarcerated his heirs in the harem, leaving the kings ill-equipped to govern and undermining the future of the dynasty. In 1721, the Ottoman ambassador described the court.
Sorrow is painted on everyone's face. The Shah has ended his career. His empire is lost.
And so an uncommon man, an outstanding ruler and a great player of the realpolitik, was ironically enough responsible for the rapid debility of his own dynasty. And he remained an enigma to the last. He was so afraid that on his death his body might be desecrated, that he arranged that on his death different shrines would receive decoy coffins all over Iran. Shah Abbas may have realized that he would be remembered for the glories of his capital city. But he would have turned in that anonymous grave if he had known then how soon Isfahan would no longer be half the world.
On this plain, the empire fell to a band of brigands. On March the 8th, 1722, a motley Persian army of about 42,000 was routed by half as many Afghan tribesmen within earshot of Isfahan. The capital was put under siege for 6 months. Famine set in. Some 80,000 died from starvation or disease. People turned to cannibalism. The women broke out from the harem, adorned with gems and pearls, clamoring in vain for bread. But no one desired their jewels or was able to give them food in exchange. They fell, exhausted and wailing, to the earth and expired. The bodies were cast away unburied. The river was everywhere full to the brim with them.